This is the Etiology Podcast. I am your host, Elka Kubaku, licensed social worker and psychotherapist. In this podcast, we explore divisive issues around food, health, and body image with the goal of mending relationships within the eating disorder recovery professional community and creating a space where a multiplicity of perspectives can coexist harmoniously. This podcast is uncensored and encompasses the political and ideological spectrum. If you believe something you hear is harmful or misinformed, please be respectful to the speaker. And also, feel free to reach out about recording another episode on the same topic from your vantage point. My hope is that if, as professionals, we can hold each other's stories with respect and compassion, we'll be better able to do so for our clients. Hey all, this is Elka Kubalkov here with the Etiology Podcast. This is going to be a solo episode. This podcast is a strange place. It doesn't have the kind of what you might call clarity or particular ideology that you will find in many eating disorder recovery spaces where you know what to believe, what type of information can and cannot be shared. So every so often, I like to record a solo episode to explain what I'm doing here because there is a method to this madness. And in this particular episode, I'm going to address the topic of triggers. Now, by triggers, I mean information that can be activating, upsetting, or destabilizing to the listener. And I will say right off the bat that this podcast is triggering by design. So you can let this be your trigger warning for all past and future episodes. In this episode, I'm going to try to break down why places will often have content warnings to avoid triggering topics, or content warnings, content rules, why I don't have those kinds of rules here, and why it's important that I don't for the purpose of this podcast, which is to mend relationships, and how I address some of the concerns that lead people to create rules around what can and cannot be shared, because those concerns are real and important, and we need to address them. Awesome. Let me backtrack a little bit. When I have guests on this podcast, and this is true for therapy as well, in addition to noticing what is being said and focusing on that and asking questions about that, I'm also noticing what is not being said. So when a topic is kind of glossed over or tiptoed around, or when somebody's sharing a story, but the story within the story is missing, it's like I can get the shell of the story, but I don't have enough texture to really connect to the person and the experience that they've had. And I don't try to pry people for information, but I do want to understand what motivates people to share or to withhold. And one of the things that I've heard repeatedly is that people don't share because they are afraid of triggering the listener. And this is something that mirrors what people are taught in many, many eating disorder recovery spaces, including treatment centers, support groups, sometimes also less formal spaces. I've seen this in a Reddit group more recently. And the goal of these rules is to protect people who are already in a vulnerable space from information that can be activating, upsetting, destabilizing, as we said before. Some examples that I've seen of content rules in eating disorder recovery spaces are no sharing of specific numbers. So things like specific weight loss or gain, specific number of calories eaten on a given day, or a specific time abstaining from a particular behavior. And the reason given for this is because those of us with eating disorders or eating disorder history can tend to focus a lot on numbers and to over fixate on those numbers in ways that are destructive. Another content rule that I've seen in spaces is not to share specifics of behaviors, whether that's food restriction or binge eating. Here's something that I read on the National Alliance for Eating Disorder Recovery. And it says not to share specifics about body shaming, weight stigma, or anti-fat bias. So instead of saying I used to hate my body because it was XYZ, saying instead I used to have a tough time understanding the judgments and shame around my body, but I'm learning how to practice body neutrality when that critical voice gets loud. Or, I've struggled to love my body. So glossing over the parts that can be painful or negative, or maybe reflect some of the judgments and fat bias in our society, and sharing those in more neutral, less emotion-provoking ways. Another type of content warning or content rule is not to share details of trauma with too much specificity. I'm going to start by painting the broad overview of why I don't do these kind of rules. And then we'll go more specifically into the type of concerns that these rules are founded in response to and how we address them. But the reason why I don't do content rules is because the goal of this podcast is to build relationships. And in building relationships, sharing more rather than less is important. Glossing over or avoiding painful topics creates distance. And just a very simple way to illustrate this is if you imagine somebody telling you a story, I should have brought an example like from a great memoir or novel, but if somebody tells you just the pure events of a story, you will notice you don't feel a strong connection to them. A story that's poorly told is a story that glosses over details. Now, if you read a very well written memoir or a novel, you will find that you feel yourself entering the person's world. And the way that they draw you into their world is by sharing with specificity what is going on with them, the texture of their experience, the emotional texture of the experience, but also the details of what's happening. This is the something that I've learned when I used to do art is that drawing is not just a difference in the way that we create or express, but it's a difference in the way we see. And specifically, the difference in the way we see is that we notice the details of what makes something something rather than just the broad strokes of it. So if you think about drawing somebody's face or recreating somebody's face, you might have seen that person's face daily and still not know how to recreate it in a way that elicits emotion from the viewer. And the reason for that is because our minds tend to think in broad generalizations. Now, if you could break that face down into its specific details and really share those in depth, that's when you can start to create something that makes the viewer feel something. And the same thing is true of writing. The same thing is true of speaking. When we bump into gridlock or we have those topics that we just can't seem to talk to each other about, we don't need to avoid those topics, or not at least not for the purpose of mending relationships, maybe to protect our own well-being. You can argue that there's a point for that. But what we need to do is go more deeply into them with more specificity and get deeper into the emotional components of them and the parts of them that make them so activating. So, in order to build relationships, we need to be able to share in an uncensored, unfiltered, and genuine way. We can't be monitoring ourselves. Now, let's talk about though, why are there content rules in spaces? And in some spaces, perhaps they are necessary when you're in a vulnerable space because our ability to engage and to tolerate information is also dependent on our capacity. So if somebody is very destabilized, maybe we need to create a sheltered space for a period of time where they can start to build something new. And then as that becomes more steady, we can do some of the exposure or start to bring other things in. So especially when we're talking about higher levels of care, this is not a criticism of what should or shouldn't be done. But I want to go deeper into the assumptions underneath it and how I address those on this podcast, which again, a podcast is different from a treatment setting. Underneath the question of do we create content rules or do we create trigger warnings or do we only allow certain information to be shared is the question of can information or can words be harmful? Now let's break this down further. Contained within this question of can words be harmful is A, can words cause pain? B, can words spread misinformation and specifically discriminatory information? And C, can words reinforce negative or destructive behaviors? And the simple answer to all three of these questions is yes. But what do we do about it? And do we respond by withholding or by sharing more? But I'm going to break each of these down into its component parts and talk about each of them on its own. Can words cause pain? Or if somebody were to tell you that somebody close to you, somebody you care about died, would you feel pain? Obviously, yes. When you read about current events on the news, do you feel pain? When you hear of an innocent person who was shot, do you feel pain? The answer to these questions is hopefully yes. So we can say that words cause pain, or you might say that the events that the words are representing cause pain, but the words are what's communicating that to us. Words cause pain, and words should cause pain. That is pain that is well spent. And the pain that words cause are actually a signal that we're in relationship with each other. And this type of pain is not an incapacitating, or hopefully not an incapacitating or silencing pain, though it depends on the capacity that we feel to take action based on it. But it's a call to action. It's energizing. And it's a sign of the relationship between us. It's a sign that we're engaging with each other. So if I hear something that someone has gone through, if somebody shares a story on here of something that they've been through that has been very painful, and I feel pain for them, that's a part of being in relationship with one another. So do words cause pain? Yes. Should we then avoid them? It depends. And the answer that I have on this podcast is no for this space, but it depends on our capacity. And in this case, it depends on yours, the listener's capacity. And there's always space because this is a podcast. It's so easy to walk out in any moment and to pause. And there's always space. And I hope to communicate to you that I respect if you do that. If you encounter or hear something that feels activating to you and you're just not ready for it, it's okay to step away. And a personal example of this for me was when I was pregnant with one of my kids. I had started reading a book that an author who I really like recommended. And the opening scene in the book was a very graphic description of a stillbirth. And being pregnant at the time, that was just not something that I wanted to have on my mind. Should the author have withheld that? No. It's what made their book a good book. It's what made their book something that you could read and feel something for. And this experience of feeling is actually enlivening when we're connecting to the person it's about. But for me at that time in my life, it was just not something that I wanted to have on my mind. So it's totally okay to hear something and step away from it. And because you have complete control over your phone, and when you hit the play and pause button, there's always space to step outside without needing to monitor this space. Now, the second way that words can cause pain, and I'm going to introduce this here, but talk about it more when I talk about the third, is if you were to imagine somebody you really care about says to you, you are ugly and worthless. Would you feel pain? Probably. And many people with eating disorders battle with or experience just negative or shaming comments from the people around them. So can words cause pain by the people around us? Now, this type of pain is a little bit different in the sense that it is in some way modified by how we feel about ourselves and how vulnerable we are to those messages. And I'll talk about that more when we talk about can words reinforce negative behavior patterns. Because this type of thought or the type of worthlessness or self-judgment, those can be seen as a kind of behavior pattern. So let's go to the second question, which is, can words spread misinformation? And again, the answer to this is yes, and it's being done on the news every single day. It's the tactic that politicians use to spread a narrative and to gain a following. So words can absolutely spread misinformation. And that misinformation can have real consequences to people's lives. A while back, I had taken a class on the Holocaust and the build-up toward the Holocaust. And one of the things that I saw was, or that we were shown, was photos from some of the newspapers in Nazi Germany prior to when all the Jews were sent to the camps. And you see these caricatures of Jews with these gigantic noses, and then there's the messages about how Jews are at the root of all of our suffering. And we see similar things happening today in many ways, though the topic of how much we can compare is its own worms. But there's no doubt that words can be used to spread misinformation, and there's no doubt that that misinformation can deeply in meaningful and sometimes really destructive ways impact the way that people live or the way that people are killed. So words can, in some way, be life and death. How do I address this concern that I might be spreading misinformation? And before I answer that question, actually, I'm going to disclose or share some of how I prepare guests who are coming on the podcast and some of what we talk about. So when I'm interviewing individuals, I tell them to talk like you're talking to a friend rather than like you're speaking to a crowd, to share your story. Everything I ask falls under the questions of what have you seen? Why do you care? How does this impact your practice? When I'm preparing people for dialogue, I talk about how I might guide you deeper into your own experience when there's conflict. We practice facing some of the things that trigger us and noticing what it brings up inside of us. So the guideline on this podcast is share what you know. Share what you know. And when we're sharing what we know, we're not making broad claims about other groups of people that we've never interacted with. We're sharing what we know. And I would argue actually that interacting with what we know and with what the other knows or what we've all been through is actually the antidote to misinformation. Interacting with stories as they are lived by real people rather than as they are spun or promoted or explained or apologetics away by people in power. So nothing on this podcast is true. Nothing. We don't make any truth claims on this podcast because the assumption under a truth claim is that I have this kind of broad reality that I will teach to you, the listener. We don't make truth claims on here. We share stories. We share stories, and sharing stories is where we start to connect to each other. And again, that is the goal of this podcast, is to connect to each other. The goal of this podcast is not to collect data or to establish treatment protocols or to change policy, where in those cases you need to make contact with some kind of truth or expand the story based on larger trends. But because this is a podcast that is focused on relationship building, we can afford to host all kinds of stories. We can afford to hear different people because we're not advocating for a large scale policy change, which obviously impacts people beyond those in this interaction. So, the one, and I don't know if I'd call this a rule, but the one framework that I have when people come on this podcast, I don't tell them not to share specifics about XYZ or what they should or shouldn't share. But the one framework that I have is share what you know. So you need to have personal interaction with the topic at hand. Now let's talk about the third question. And this is actually the most modifiable or the least absolute in some ways, which is, can words reinforce destructive behavior patterns? And the answer to this question is it depends how vulnerable you are. And anyone who's been through recovery has seen this play out in their own lives in some way. So one example is shortly after my husband and I got married, he decided he wanted to go on a ketogenic diet. And I was somewhat newly-ish recovered from an eating disorder, and I was beginning to let go of the last of my food rules. And we got into a kind of argument where I was like, what do you mean you have hunger and fullness signals? Like, you should use them. This is a gift. Um, and I got kind of emotional, and then he's like to me, that is true for you, not for me. And he was right. That point is true. And he went on the keto diet, and both of us were okay. Um, he was on it for a period, said he felt good on it, lost some weight, and then went off of it and gained all the weight back, but didn't develop an eating disorder. Um, and I'm noticing even as I'm telling the story that I do have some of the eating disorder recovery stuff where I'm like, should I say that he lost or gained weight? Does that even matter? Because maybe weight is not so important. So I can kind of hear that dialogue that I see my guests come on with inside of my own head because it's so pervasive in the eating disorder recovery world. Because in many ways, this world was founded in a rejection of diet culture, which is really harmful, but especially to people who are born in larger bodies. But that was kind of a segue. But now, if he decided to go on a keto diet, it just would not have any impact on me at all. And I try to support him in it as best I could. Like, it just doesn't. It's not upsetting to me. And you've probably experienced this yourself. If you've been through recovery, there might have been a time when seeing someone in a certain type of body would have triggered you. Seeing someone who's lost weight might have triggered you, or hearing a particular comment from someone would have triggered you. And many people in eating disorder recovery deal with fatphobic comments from family or from really anywhere in society. Um, I remember also there were so many of these. I remember also seeing a like photo while I was at a mall once, of someone in a very thin body, and again, I'm really like not. I guess I do still hold this tension because I'm realizing as I'm talking that I have a lot of hesitation myself on bringing in anything about weight. And like there are so many different types of reactions that people can have to comments about weight as someone who is in a what you might call a straight size body at this point in time, besides that I'm really short. But I had gained a lot of weight from binge eating and stuff, and I've seen a picture and it like felt really, really upset afterwards and was like hardly even acknowledging how much I cared about it. But and now again, those pictures just don't mean anything to me. So you might have had that experience where you had a period in your life where certain behaviors from certain people were really triggering, or people in treatment centers will often experience that kind of comparison. So something that might be very vulnerable and destructive to you at some point will start to lose its power as you become exposed to it and as you become stronger in your own recovery. And this is the explicit goal that's put in exposure therapy, for example, where we want to face the things that we're afraid of because they help us get stronger. And when we have the experience of facing that thing we're afraid of and preventing the response, exposure response prevention, but staying with our own experience and being willing to tolerate it, we start to build our capacity. We start to be able to handle some of those things. And this is really, really important in relationships because relationships will trigger every wound that we have, every wound that we didn't know we had. So the more we build our capacity to stay with that discomfort, the more we're able to engage with each other. The more we increase our capacity to stay with that discomfort, the more we're able to relate to each other, and the more we're able to have different difficult conversations in which both people are heard. When I did my clinical internship, the words that I heard my supervisor use for this was that our triggers show us where our work is. So if I encounter something and feel really emotional about it, or find myself having a really strong reaction to it, that shows me where something inside myself is hurt, where there's an open wound inside myself, and I can then stay with that open wound and start to heal. So the way that I try or hope to approach these conversations is one, without rules, and underneath that without rules, there's this kind of respect for you, the listener, that you can either handle what is being shared, and also a respect for your capacity that if you can't, you can know that and step away. So when you feel triggered by something you hear on this podcast, you can pause the episode, you can stay with your experience, or you can reach out to me and I'd love to hear from you, maybe talk about what it brings up for you. If you want to record another episode about it, I really love to do multiple episodes on the same topic and what it triggers for each of us because that is so unique and different for each person, and that is what allows us to connect to each other, is the willingness to stay with what the other triggers inside of us and what we trigger inside of the other. So please listen to this podcast, share it, like it, let other people take part in it. And if you get triggered, you can let yourself get triggered. And feel free to reach out to me and share what gets activated inside of you so that you and I can connect.